She had a knife at his throat, a wound that was killing her, hidden beneath her sleeve, and the man who would become her husband would not look away from either one. That was the moment, not the finding of her, not the days of fever that followed, not the slow and terrible mending. That was the one Gideon Hale would carry with him for the rest of his life. A young Apache woman standing in his barn in the blue hour before sunrise, her sleeve shoved up to her elbow, at his insistence, a wound going bad beneath the wrapping she'd fashioned herself from a strip of her own dress, and a skinning knife pressed flat against his jaw. Shaking, both of them, shaking him from something that wasn't quite fear, and her from something that wasn't quite rage. The man who forced her to be seen, really seen, for the first time, would become the man she chose as her husband. Her name was Dyani. And this is what happened to her in the summer of 1882, in the high desert country of the New Mexico Territory, when the land was burning and the old ways were breaking, and a woman could disappear into the hills and still not be far enough from what was hunting her. If you want to know how a hidden wound becomes the beginning of a love story, stay till the end. And if this kind of story means something to you, a like and a subscribe keeps them coming. Now let's go back to the beginning. Gideon Hale was 29 years old. The summer his neighbor found what was left of a slaver camp 3 miles east of his property line. He heard about it at the feed store in Cobry, a dry goods man named Portis, who had a gift for the kind of story that made your coffee go cold. The camp had been abandoned in a hurry. Chains left in the red dirt, a fire still smoldering. And tracks, many tracks, some heading northwest toward the Mesa country, and one set heading due south, cutting through scrub in a straight line that didn't follow any trail a person would normally take. Somebody running. Somebody who knew exactly where every rock and shadow lay. Gideon listened. He bought his flour and his salt. He drove his wagon home along the canyon road, and he thought about those tracks the whole way. The way a straight line through the desert means a person isn't wandering, means they are running towards something specific or away from something absolute. He had come to New Mexico 2 years before from a cattle spread in Texas, following his older brother Emmett, who had bought land sight unseen from a man passing through their town with a survey map and a persuasive tongue. Emmett's wife Ada had died of a fever the previous winter, and Emmett had decided that staying in Texas was the same as dying slowly, and he would rather go somewhere new and die of something interesting. Gideon had followed, because he was the kind of younger brother who followed. He had no wife to anchor him, no land of his own, yet just a good horse and a set of tools, and the understanding that brothers were the thing you kept. The New Mexico land was harder than the map suggested. The summer heat was a wall you walked into every morning. Water rights were a permanent negotiation. But the cattle were doing well enough, and Gideon was building something he could call his own on the southeastern corner of the spread, a stone and adobe house that was not finished yet but had 3 solid walls and a proper roof, which was more than he'd expected by this point in the year. His brother Emmett's place was a half-mile north. They ate supper together on most nights. Gideon was not a lonely man in the way that some men are lonely, the kind who fill a room and still feel apart from everything. He was quiet by disposition, methodical, interested in problems that had solutions. He fed his cattle before himself. He tracked weather patterns in a small journal he kept on a shelf by the door. He had learned some Spanish from the men who worked the neighboring ranches, and he was learning more slowly a few words of the Apache languages spoken in the territory, partly because it seemed sensible, and partly because it troubled him that he had lived in this country for 2 years and knew almost nothing of the people who had lived in it for centuries before him. He was not a man given to speeches about justice. He was a man who fixed the fence that was broken and didn't wait to be asked. 3 days after he heard the story at the feed store, he came out at first light to check on a mare who'd been favoring her left foreleg and found the barn door standing an inch open. He pushed it wider with his shoulder, not alarmed yet, thinking an animal had nosed it loose in the night. The interior was darker than the pre-dawn sky, which itself was barely gray. He let his eyes adjust. She was in the far corner, in the stall that stood empty, half buried in old hay. She had gone. Still, the instant the door moved, and she was very good at stillness. He might have missed her entirely if he hadn't been the kind of man who looked at things all the way to their edges. She was pressed back against the planks, knees drawn up, one arm wrapped across her middle, watching him the way a person watches when they are calculating whether they can run. She could not run. That much was clear before anything else. Whatever stillness she had achieved was costing her enormously. He could see it in the compression of her jaw, in the way her breath was coming in shallow pulls that weren't quite even. He stepped inside and stopped. He put his hands where she could see them, open and at his sides, and he held still for a moment because whatever he did next was going to determine everything. There were things a man in his position could do that were wrong, and he had no interest in any of them. She was young, early 20s at most, dark-eyed, her hair loose and tangled with burrs and red dust. She wore a dress of good buckskin, badly torn along one side and over it a cloth wrapper that made no sense in the summer heat until he understood what it was hiding. She was wrapping a wound, not hiding discomfort. Hiding a wound that had been going bad for days. He could smell it faintly over the hay and animal scent of the barn. "I'm not going to hurt you." In English first, because that was what he had. Then he tried the phrase in the Spanish he'd learned, because he did not have enough Apache to say anything useful yet. "No te voy a hacer daño." She didn't move. He crouched, very slowly, putting himself below her eye level, because he had learned from watching horses that you made yourself smaller when something was frightened and you wanted it to understand you were not a threat. A short phrase in Apache fell from her lips, low, flat, with no question in it. He did not know the words, but he understood the tone. It was the tone of someone who has reached the last thing they intend to say. He looked at the wrapping around her midsection. "Let me see it." She moved faster than he expected, faster than someone in her condition had any right to move, and the knife was at his jaw before he'd registered the motion. A skinning knife, well made, the blade dull with use but still serviceable. Her grip was correct. She knew exactly what she was doing with it. She pushed his sleeve up with her other hand, and he thought for a moment she was going to cut him, and then he understood she was showing him something. Her forearm, a brand still raw at its edges, the scar tissue new and angry. The mark a slaver made. "I see it." He kept his voice level. "I see it. I know what it means." She held his gaze for a long moment. The knife did not move. Then something in her face shifted, not softness. Nothing so simple as that, but a recalculation, the kind a person does when the evidence no longer supports the conclusion they arrived with. She lowered the knife a fraction of an inch. He didn't take it from her. He left it in her hand. "The wound, under the wrapping. Will you let me look at it? I've dealt with infections before, cattle and horses mostly, but the principle's the same." He paused. "I think you know a lot more than I do about the principle, but you can't reach it yourself. Not at the angle it's sitting." A very long silence. Then, slowly, watching him without blinking, she lifted the corner of the wrapping. The wound was an arrow graze that had gone septic, not a deep wound, not the kind that hit anything vital, but the kind that festered when it went untended and unwashed, and when the person carrying it had been moving for days, without stopping, because stopping meant being caught. The edges were inflamed, the center draining badly. Another 2 days and she would have been too far gone for any amount of attention to matter. Gideon looked at it for exactly as long as he needed to look at it. He stood up, carefully, and went to get what he needed. He brought a basin of water he heated on the stove, and clean cloth he tore from a shirt he'd been meaning to mend anyway, and the small tin of drawing salve he kept for the cattle, and which served equally well on human skin if the smell didn't bother you. He brought a cup of water for her to drink, because she was badly dehydrated. He could see it in the skin under her eyes, in the way her lips were cracked, and he set it near her without pressing her to take it. She watched every movement he made. The knife stayed in her hand. When he knelt beside her again, she held herself completely rigid, every muscle braced, and he understood that this kind of proximity to a strange man was something she endured rather than accepted, and that her enduring it at all meant she was more desperate than she was showing. He worked quickly and carefully. He did not talk while he worked, because talking while doing something difficult is usually more for the person talking than the person being helped, and she did not need his reassurance. She needed his attention on the wound. It took about 20 minutes. When he was done, he sat back on his heels and looked at her. She looked at the bandaging he'd applied, then at him. He pointed toward the house. "You can sleep inside. There's a room, the back room. I haven't finished it yet, but there's a pallet and a door that closes. No one will bother you." He pointed at the cup of water she hadn't touched. "Drink that first." She looked at the water for a long moment. She drank it. Her name was Dyani. He didn't know that yet, and she did not tell him for several days. The fever hit the following afternoon, which he had half expected. When a wound that has been going bad for days is finally cleaned, it sometimes gets worse before it gets better, as the body recognizes the fight it has on its hands. She was in the back room when it started, and he might not have known for hours if he hadn't been replacing the latch on the hall door when he heard the small controlled sound she made. Not a cry, nothing so voluntarily expressive as that, but an involuntary catch of breath that a person makes when pain overrides the discipline they've spent years building. He knocked on the door. No answer. He knocked again, warning her he was going to open it and she should say so now if she didn't want him to. She didn't answer. She was on the pallet with her arm pressed across her face. The fever was well established, her skin dry and radiating heat. He put the back of his hand near her forehead and felt the temperature from an inch away. He spent the next 18 hours in that room. He slept in the chair when she was quiet and was awake when she wasn't. He changed the cloth on her wound and kept water near her, and when the fever broke in the early hours of the second day, and she came back to herself in the way a person surfaces from deep water, suddenly aware of where they are and not entirely glad about it, he was sitting by the window watching the color come back into the sky. She lay still for a long time. He could tell she was awake by the quality of her breathing. The fever broke. He didn't look away from the window. "You're going to be all right." Nothing from her for a while. Then, very quietly, in English that was careful and clearly built, word by word, from a long time spent listening, "You did not have to do that." He thought about his answer. "No," he agreed. "I didn't." She lay still for the rest of that morning. But he noticed, when he came back at midday with food, that she had moved to the window herself and was watching the yard, watching the distances the way a person watches when they are thinking about what is safe and what isn't, and making decisions about staying. She stayed. Her name was Dyani, which she told him on the fourth day, not as an offer of friendship, but as a correction. He had been referring to her in his own head as the woman, and apparently something in the way he greeted her in the mornings betrayed this, because she offered her name with a slight precision that implied she expected him to use it. He used it. She had been born in a band of the western Apache in the mountains north of the Gila River, born to a family of healers, which was not precisely a hereditary role, but which ran in families because knowledge ran in family. Her mother had been the person the band came to when the children had fever, when the old men's lungs went bad in winter, when the hunters came back with broken bones or worse. Dyani had learned at her mother's side, had learned the plants and the poultices and the order of things, what you did first and what you did second, and what you left alone, because some bodies needed to heal themselves if you gave them the conditions for it. She had been taken in a raid by men who were not Apache and not military, and operated in the gray country between both. men who sold what they caught and moved fast enough that the law never quite caught up to them. She had been held for several weeks. She had gotten away. She did not tell Gideon how she had gotten away, and he did not ask. The brand on her arm she covered. Not from shame. She would tell him that later with the particular flatness of someone making a factual correction. She covered it because it was evidence of what they had done to her, and she was not interested in carrying their mark in places where other people could see it and have opinions about it. She had been heading for the mountain country, where she thought there might still be people she recognized, when the wound had slowed her and the fever had started building, and she had made the calculation, the same calculation Gideon had made in the barn, without the luxury of as much time, that the wrong choice made quickly was sometimes the only choice available. This came out over the course of several days in pieces, the way things surface when you are accustomed to keeping them to yourself and are not yet entirely sure the telling is safe. He listened. The questions he put to her were few and specific. How far north? Which pass? How long ago? The kind that implied he was thinking about the practical situation rather than satisfying curiosity about her past. She noticed this. He could tell she noticed it by the small recalibrations in her manner, the way trust was not given, but built, one piece of evidence at a time. She healed faster than he expected, or maybe faster than she was letting on. Within a week she was up and moving around the property, not in any conspicuous way, but in the systematic way of someone who is learning the layout of a place, what is where, and what it leads to, and which directions of departure exist. He understood this and did not comment on it. A person who had been hunted memorized exits the way a cautious man memorizes his neighbor's faces. She began to help with the work. Not because he asked her to, and not as any kind of payment for what he'd done. She was very clear, in the way that people are clear about things that matter, that she did not consider herself indebted to him. She helped because she was a person who was bored by inaction, and because keeping her hands busy was one of the ways she managed the things she carried, the vigilance and the memory that didn't rest. Those first weeks, she was guarded in the particular way of someone who has calculated exactly how much to reveal and is holding everything else in reserve. She ate when he ate, and she slept when she could, and she never, not once, let him hear her moving at night. Though he could sometimes tell by the disposition of things in the morning, a cup moved, the kitchen door latched differently, that she had not been entirely still in the dark hours. She was patrolling, he understood. Not his property, which she knew was not a threat. She was patrolling the edges of her own endurance, checking the borders of what she could allow herself. He gave her space. He gave her time. He did not push for conversation, and he did not perform cheerfulness in the kitchen the way some men perform cheerfulness around a frightened animal, that overbright energy that is its own kind of pressure. He was simply himself, steady, unhurried, getting on with his work, and over the days she began to meet that steadiness with something that was not quite ease, but was in the same direction. One afternoon, toward the end of her second week, he came back from checking the cattle to find her on the roof of the lean-to he'd been meaning to patch, replacing a section of split shingles with pieces she'd cut herself from a cedar plank she'd found in the corner of the barn. She worked with the same economical precision she brought to everything. No wasted movement, no testing of what she already knew. When she heard him below, she did not stop working or look down. She finished the piece she was on. He looked at her work from the ground. It was better than what had been there before. You didn't have to do that, I know. She came down from the roof without asking for help, and she didn't need it. She knew the plants in the arroyos. She knew which of the low-growing shrubs had roots that would take the swelling out of a joint, and which had leaves that dried into a useful poultice. She began to go out in the mornings and come back with things gathered in the cloth she'd folded as a carrier, and she would process them in the corner of the kitchen with a focus that reminded him of the way a craftsman worked, no wasted motion, everything purposeful. He watched her work sometimes. He tried not to watch in a way that was intrusive. but he was genuinely interested in what she knew, the way he was genuinely interested in most things that were competently done. One morning he asked if she would show him what she was making. She looked at him for a moment with the evaluating expression he was learning to read, the expression that meant she was deciding whether a question was what it appeared to be or something else. She showed him. She placed the dried leaves in his hand and told him in the careful English she was building word by word as they spoke that these reduced a fever that came from infected cuts, that these were for the lungs when the dry heat damaged them, that these, the small dark ones, needed to be respected, meaning you used very little and always knew what you were combining them with. She had the same seriousness talking about the plants that she had doing everything else, the kind of seriousness that meant what she knew mattered to her, not as knowledge to hoard, but as knowledge that saved lives and therefore deserved to be held carefully. He put questions to her. Her answers were always more complete than the questions warranted, which was the mark of someone who thought in systems rather than individual facts. He started keeping notes in the same journal where he tracked weather. At first, she watched him do this with something cautious in her expression, as if she was uncertain whether the act of writing her knowledge down was a respect or a removal. He showed her the journal, the entry, the plant name as she'd given it, then his phonetic attempt at the Apache word, then the properties she'd described. He pointed at the entry. Had he gotten it right? She looked at the page for a moment. Then she reached across and corrected his phonetic spelling with a small, decisive mark of the pen. The days settled into a rhythm. Not a comfortable rhythm yet, not easy, but a structured one, the kind that two people establish when they are both methodical and both unwilling to create unnecessary friction. They worked, they ate, they talked when there was something to say. The silences were not comfortable exactly, but they were not charged either, and that was enough for now. Gideon's brother Emmett rode over on a Wednesday afternoon and found Dyani in the yard repairing a section of fence that had gone soft at the post. Emmett was a good man. He was also a man who had grown up in the same time and place as everyone else in the territory, and there was a moment when he looked at her that Gideon recognized and didn't like. He introduced her by name. He explained she had been hurt and was healing here. Emmett's expression was not hostile so much as complicated, and later, when they were out of her hearing, the conversation was brief and direct. There was going to be talk, Emmett said. There was always talk, Gideon answered. It wasn't what concerned him. What concerned him was whether she was safe, whether the men who had taken her were still looking, and whether the people around here were going to be a problem. Emmett was quiet for a moment. Then, I won't be a problem. Gideon already knew that. The town of Cobre was small enough. The news of an Apache woman at the Hale ranch arrived before Gideon's next trip in for supplies. He could see it in the way conversations stopped when he walked into the feed store, in the way Portis, the dry goods man, asked after his health with a careful extra attention that meant he was working up to something. Portis worked up to it. He'd heard Gideon had taken in an Apache woman. He hoped Gideon understood the situation in the territory right now was delicate. Some people were saying things. Gideon bought his supplies. On his way out, he let Portis know he would pass along their concerns to the woman in question and see what she thought of them. Then he drove home. He gave Dyani a straight account of what had happened at the store, no softening, because she was not a person who would thank him for it. She listened. Her expression was the flat, careful expression she used when she was deciding something. They are afraid. Yes, because they do not know me. Because they don't know you, he agreed, and because knowing you would require them to reconsider some things they'd rather not reconsider. That's harder for some people than others. She looked at him. Are you afraid? He thought about it. Not of you. Something in her face shifted very slightly. A small, unwilling thing. He had been measuring his behavior by one standard since she arrived. What would a decent person do? Not what the town expected. Not what made his own life easier. but what a person of basic decency would do for another person who had been badly hurt and needed somewhere to be while she healed. He had not been thinking beyond that in any particular way. He was thinking beyond it now, and the thinking was somewhat alarming, and he filed it away to consider at a later time when he was less busy. Her past came for her on a Tuesday in late July. He didn't know it was coming. Neither did she, or she would have handled it differently. There were 3 of them. He didn't know their names. She recognized them, which told him they'd been part of the operation that had taken her, but she never gave him those names out loud, and he didn't press for them. They rode in mid-morning when Gideon was working on the second wall of the new barn addition, and they were casual about it in the way men are casual when they believe they hold all the advantage. The leader was a heavy-set man with a mustache, who introduced himself as representing certain business interests and said he was looking for a piece of runaway property. He used the word property. Gideon heard it and felt something very cold and very clear settle into place in his chest. Dyani was in the house. She had heard the horses. Gideon set down the tool he was holding and faced the 3 men. He told them there was no property on his land that belonged to them. The leader explained, patiently and with the particular condescension of a man who expects his patience to be recognized as a kind of generosity, that they had documentation, a bill of sale. Gideon's response was that a bill of sale for a human being was worth exactly what it was written on, which was nothing. The leader's patience recalibrated. He said things could go different ways, and he thought they should all consider the ways. Gideon had a rifle. He had left it inside, which was an error he registered without agitation, the kind of error you noted and filed because you couldn't change it now, and losing your head about it would make everything worse. He had the tool in his hand, which wasn't much, and he had 3 men who appeared to be armed and were positioned between him and the door. What happened next happened very fast. Dyani came out the back, not the front door, the back, through the kitchen, around the corner of the building, in a route he hadn't seen her take before, but which he realized later she'd mapped out the first week she was there. She had his rifle. She was also, he noticed, very calm. Calmer than the situation seemed to call for, which he understood when he remembered that she had been in situations like this before, had survived them, and had not done so by panicking. The 3 men recalibrated. There followed something that was less a conversation than a set of decisions made in real time about what each party was willing to do. Dyani did not address the men. She kept her eyes on them while her voice went quietly to Gideon, the mix of English and Apache words he'd been slowly learning, giving him the essential information, who they were, what they wanted, and what she had already worked through regarding what happened next. What happened next was that the 3 men left, not gracefully, but they left. He would not have said, if asked, that he was unafraid during any of that. He would have said there was no point in being distracted by the fear. After the men were gone, and the dust of their horses had settled back into the red ground, Dyani stood in the yard for a moment. She was still holding the rifle. Then she lowered it and leaned it against the house and sat down on the step. He sat down beside her. He didn't say anything for a while. There didn't seem to be anything immediately necessary to say. After a time she spoke. "Oh, they will come back with more." He nodded. "I expect so." "You should not have." She stopped. Started over. "This is not your problem. It became my problem when I let you into my barn." She looked at him sharply. He thought for a moment he'd said the wrong thing. "That is not a reason. You did not know what you were letting in. I knew enough." He looked out at the yard. "I knew you were hurt and someone had done it to you and you needed somewhere to be. That was enough to know." He paused. "I haven't regretted it. Not for a single day." The sharp look softened, fractionally. It was the smallest thing, the kind of shift you would miss if you weren't paying close attention to a person's face, and he was paying close attention. "I know." A pause, quietly. "I know you haven't. They sat there for a while longer. The morning was very bright. Gideon rode to his brother Emmett that afternoon. He explained the situation plainly and made clear he could use another gun for the next several days and possibly longer. Emmett had no questions. He packed a bag. There were 2 men from the neighboring ranch, Eduardo and his cousin Mateo, both of whom Gideon had worked alongside for a year and both of whom he trusted, who agreed to rotate through for the next week. He paid them. He explained what might be coming. They understood. Dyani watched the preparations. She was not passive in them. She knew the terrain better than any of the men who'd arrived to help, having spent the first weeks of her time here, walking every approach and depression and likely vantage point in a radius that extended far enough to matter. She laid out the vulnerabilities for Gideon in the kitchen one evening, drawing the approach angles with her finger on the tabletop. He adjusted accordingly. There were 2 more visits in the following 10 days. The first was a single rider who came to the edge of the property and stopped and watched for a while and left. Gideon saw him from the window and went very still and kept quiet until the rider was gone, and then found Dyani already in the kitchen, her back to the wall, watching the yard through the glass, with the focused blank expression she had when she was preparing for something. "He's gone," he was counting. Her eyes didn't move from the yard. How many of us will we have? He had thought the same thing. The second was a more organized attempt, 4 men better positioned in the hour before dawn, that ended badly for them, and not for anyone at the Hale ranch, though Eduardo took a graze along his shoulder that Dyani cleaned and wrapped with the same efficiency and the same controlled care that she had applied to her own wound weeks before. After the second attempt, there was a discussion involving Gideon, Emmett, Eduardo, Mateo, and a man from Cobre who served as the nearest approximation to law enforcement in the county. The man from Cobre took a detailed accounting of what had happened and what the men who'd come had claimed, and what their documentation was worth in a territory where the law was what you could enforce. The documentation, it turned out, was worth nothing to anyone who looked at it carefully, which the man from Cobre did, with a kind of deliberate attention that made clear he understood what he was looking at. There was no third visit. Gideon brought the news to Dyani that evening. She received it without visible relief, which he understood was not the absence of relief, but the absence of the habit of it. She had learned not to let go of vigilance, because things that seemed resolved had a way of returning in different forms. You believe it's over. For now, those particular men, but not others like them. The territory is what it is. He looked at her steadily. But you're not running anymore. And you're not alone. She was quiet for a while. Then, why does that matter to you? You did not know me. I know you now. She looked at him. The evening light was coming through the kitchen window at an angle that caught the copper tones in her hair and the particular quality of her eyes, which were not just dark but deep, the kind of dark that has layers to it, that you could look into for a long time without reaching the bottom. He had been, as noted, thinking things. He had been filing them away for a later time. It seemed possible that the later time was now. I know you're capable, he told her. I know you're a healer. I know you think before you act and you don't make decisions from fear, even when the fear is reasonable. I know you don't give anything that isn't genuinely meant, which means that anything you do give means something. He paused. I know that you have been carrying a great deal without anyone to carry any of it with you for a long time. And I know that you don't want to need anyone, and I think that's a perfectly sensible way to have gotten through what you've gotten through, and I'm not asking you to need me. She waited. I'm asking if you'd want to stay, not because you have nowhere else to go. If you want to go north to the mountain country to find your people, I'll help you do that. I'll ride with you as far as you want company. But if you wanted to stay here, he considered. I would like that. I would like it very much. And I want to be clear about what I'm saying. I'm not offering you shelter in exchange for anything. I'm saying I would like to build something here with you if that's something you'd consider." The silence was long. Outside, an evening bird started up somewhere in the mesquite. Dyani looked at her hands. The brand on her arm was covered, as it always was, by the wrap of cloth she wore, but he'd seen it. He knew it was there. He had never, not once, looked at it with anything she could have interpreted as pity or revision. She looked up. "I am not easy. I know. There are things I don't talk about. There are things I won't do in certain ways on certain days. There are times when I need to be by myself without explaining why. I'm a quiet man. I understand needing to be alone." She studied him. The evaluation in her face was like nothing he had seen on anyone else. Not suspicious, exactly. Not hostile, but thorough, the way a good healer looks at a wound before deciding what it needs. "I would want to bring my own knowledge. To make something useful here. Not just to—" She searched for the word. "Not just to be here. I'd want that too. What you know about those plants, the healing work. That's something this territory needs badly. There's a doctor in Cobre who is the doctor only because there is no one else, and he drinks in the mornings." Something crossed her face that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. It was brief. It changed everything for a moment. "There is a great deal I could teach you about what grows in these arroyos. I'd like to learn." Another silence, shorter this time. "I would consider staying. I am not saying yes to everything at once. I am saying I would consider it." He nodded. "That's enough for now." The consideration took 3 more months. He did not rush it. Rushing was not in his nature, and he understood, moreover, that what she was weighing was not a small thing. She was deciding whether the evidence warranted trusting something she had been comprehensively taught not to trust, by experience rather than by theory, and experience was a harder teacher to argue with than any amount of words. She stayed, and she paid attention, and she built her assessment, piece by piece, with the same methodical care she brought to everything. He helped her send a message north through a trading network Eduardo had mentioned to a contact who might know the band she'd been born into. It took 6 weeks for a reply to come back, and the reply contained news that was mixed. Some of her family were accounted for, some were not, and he sat with her in the kitchen while she read it, and he did not try to say anything that would make it easier, because some things do not get easier, and saying they will is a form of lying. She cried once. It was private, and he gave her the privacy. He came back half an hour later with coffee and made no reference to it. She went north once in the fall for 3 weeks to find the people she'd learned were findable. He did not ask her not to go. He thought about asking, but he didn't, because the question would have implied she owed him something, and she did not owe him anything, and also because she would have gone anyway, and the asking would have only made things awkward between them. The 3 weeks were long. He did his work, and he did not think about it excessively, but he noticed that the house sounded different without her. In it, the way a room sounds different when something has been removed from it, not the noise of the thing, but its weight in the space. He noticed the corner of the kitchen where she worked with her plants was undisturbed, and the stillness of it was somehow louder than her presence had been. He had a horse pull up lame, and he sat with the animal in the barn for a long afternoon, applying a poultice he'd learned from her notes, working from the instructions she had given him, and he thought, she taught me this, she gave me this, and the thought was not sentimental but plain, the way practical gratitude is plain, which is its own kind of depth. She came back. She did not explain herself, and he did not expect her to. But she came back, and that was its own kind of statement. She came back, and she had brought things, small things, wrapped carefully, that she set on the kitchen table without ceremony. Seeds from plants that grew in the mountain country, and could be coaxed to survive at lower elevation if the soil was worked right. A small piece of beadwork, mostly blue and white, that she unfolded from its wrapping and laid flat on the table and looked at for a long moment before she set it on the shelf where her clay pot stood. He did not ask whose it had been. He understood it was a piece of somewhere she had been from, carried back into somewhere she was going. The winter was cold, and they spent a great deal of it inside. By the fireplace, Gideon had finished building in November, with stone from the arroyo. The house was fully enclosed now, both walls done, the roof solid. She had a room that was hers, with a door that locked from the inside, and a window that faced east, so she could see the light coming before he did. They talked, in the long evenings, more than either of them was accustomed to talking. He talked about Texas, about his parents, about his brother's grief, and the way grief made Emmett restless, and how he understood that even as he found restlessness uncomfortable himself. She shared things in return, not everything, not the whole of it, but pieces, the pieces she chose, and he understood that each chosen piece was something of value. She described her mother's work, the way the healing knowledge was organized, not as a list of remedies, but as an understanding of the body's own intentions, what it was trying to do when it ran a fever, when a wound swelled, when a person couldn't sleep. You worked with the intention, not against it. You cleared the path for what the body already knew how to do. He thought about this for several days. Then one evening he offered that this was probably a better way to think about most problems, not just healing. She turned it over. Most problems were the same problem, she decided aloud. Something blocked between what is. You find the block, you remove it, or you work around it. The rest follows. E thought she was right. He also thought this applied to things considerably beyond medicine. The snow came in January, not heavy but enough to keep them close to the property for a week. Emmett came over twice with the sled, and they ate together, the four of them. Emmett had been, very quietly, and without ever directly stating an opinion, treating Dyani with the same matter-of-fact courtesy he extended to everyone he liked, which Gideon recognized as his brother's way of saying everything he felt. The week of the snow was the week the wall came down, not dramatically, not in any single moment, but in the cumulative way of things that have been approaching for a long time. One evening, she fell asleep by the fire. He knew she rarely slept easily, that she woke quickly and fully at small sounds, that her sleep was never the deep unconscious thing it was for people who had not learned to survive, and she slept for 2 hours with the ease of someone who was, on some level she had not yet consciously acknowledged, safe. He sat across from her and watched her sleep, and thought about the woman who had put a knife to his jaw in the barn in the hour before sunrise, who had shown him the brand on her arm as a statement, not a wound, who had drunk the water he brought and not offered a thank you, because thank you was not the language she thought in, who expressed what she felt through what she did, through what she let happen, through the fact of staying. He had been, he realized, in love with her for a very long time. The realization was not a surprise. It was more like arriving at a destination you'd been walking toward and finally looking up from the path. In February, he asked her to marry him. He did not make a ceremony of the asking. He was not a man who made ceremonies of things. He thought there was something honest about saying a significant thing, plainly, rather than dressing it up, until the plain meaning got lost in the dressing. He was at the kitchen table and she was across from him, and he told her he wanted to marry her if she was willing, that he understood if she wasn't, and that it would change nothing fundamental between them either way. She did not answer immediately. He had expected this. She was quiet for a while, looking at the grain of the wood tabletop and the way she looked at things when she was thinking past the obvious surface. Then she asked what it would mean to him. He thought about it carefully. It would mean you're mine and I'm yours, and that I'm not going to be a person who leaves whatever happens. He paused. It would mean I'd like the rest of my life to be spent with you in it. That's what it would mean. She was quiet again. It would mean I had decided something. Her voice was slow and deliberate. Yes, that I had decided to be here. that this is where I belong. If it is, she looked at him, the evaluating look, the thorough one, the one that went all the way in. He held it. They were married in the spring, on a morning in April, when the desert was briefly and extravagantly green, and the air smelled of the rain that had come through 2 days before. Emmett was there. A woman from Cobre named Pearl Radner, who ran the dry goods store now that Portis had retired to his sister's house in Santa Fe, and who had been, without announcement, one of the quiet, decent people, the kind who don't make speeches about decency but simply act from it. Dyani wore her best buckskin, the one she had mended carefully over the winter with sinew, and a needle made of bone, and she wore her hair braided in a way he had not seen her wear it before, and she was so entirely herself, so completely, specifically, her, that Gideon had the feeling of looking at a thing he might not have been able to see before, a thing that required all the months of paying attention to become visible. She wore the brand under her sleeve. She would always cover it in company. But in the mornings, when it was just the two of them in the kitchen, and the light was coming in from the east window, she did not bother, and the scar lay on her arm, the way all scars lay, evidence of what had been survived, shaped into the body of the person who had survived it. He had stopped thinking of it as a mark they had put on her. He thought of it as a map, of sorts, a record of a road that had led her here. She built a garden that summer. Not a purely practical garden, though it was practical. The healing plants, the things she processed and dried and kept in careful order in the clay pots. She fired herself in a small kiln she constructed from the same arroyo stone he'd used for the fireplace. She planted other things, too, things her mother had grown, things that served no purpose beyond their growing, beyond the color they put into the dry air. He helped her plant them. He was not skilled at it. She showed him the depth for each root, the spacing, the way you turned the soil at the edges rather than the center. He paid attention. He got dirt on his hands up to the wrists, and she looked at his hands, and something in her face did the thing it did sometimes, the small, involuntary thing that was better than any smile he'd ever seen on anyone. You are learning. I'm trying. That is the same thing, for someone who tries honestly. That evening they sat on the step of the house, the step they had sat on together the afternoon. The men left, the first time they had sat side by side and said nothing, and it had been enough, and the sky went through its colors, the blue into the orange, into the rose into the deep. And the desert smelled of sage, and the cooled stone of the walls, and the faint sweetness of her garden coming into its first growth. She was leaning against him slightly, in the way she had gradually permitted herself to lean against things, not heavily, not with the unconscious abandon of someone who has never had reason for caution, but with the deliberate, chosen ease of someone who has decided that this particular thing is worth leaning on. He put his arm around her. Tell me something you know. It was a question he came back to, and she always had an answer. She considered. The evening moved over the hills. A wound that is kept hidden becomes the wound that kills. A wound that is seen can heal. This is true of the body. A pause. I think it is true of everything. He thought about the barn, the early morning, the knife at his jaw, and the wound at her side. The way the seeing of it had been the thing that mattered, not just the tending of it, but the seeing, the refusal to look away, the recognition that what was hidden was not less real for being hidden. I think you're right. She almost always was the New Mexico desert, went on in its ancient indifferent way around them, the same red land, the same distances, the same stars coming out one by one as the light faded. But inside the perimeter of what they had built together, inside the house, with its solid walls and its east-facing window and its garden beginning to root and take hold, there was something that had not been there before. Not safety, exactly. The territory was still what it was. The world was still what it was. But something that in the right light looked like it. Dyani kept her mother's knowledge and added to it and passed it on, in time, to others who came to the ranch looking for it. A settler child with a bad chest, a vaquero's wife with a complicated birth, a mescalero man she met by chance at a trading post who recognized the particular way she organized her kit and asked her who she had learned from, and she told him, and his face did the thing that faces do when something lost is unexpectedly recovered. Gideon kept the ranch. He kept his quiet journal of weather patterns. He kept learning the plants, the language, the long and layered history of the country he had come to live in, which was not a history of empty land, but of everything that had happened on it, all the way back and all the way forward. He was a better student than he had expected to be. They built more of the ranch over the following years. A proper barn, eventually, to replace the first one, though Gideon was never able to look at the corner stall without thinking of the gray pre-dawn light and the woman pressed back against the planks and the specific quality of a person who is calculating whether they can run. He brought this up with her once, years later. She was quiet for a moment, and then a slow certainty moved through her voice. I decided not to run the moment I understood you would not look away. He wanted to know what she meant. When you look at a wound, she answered, there is a way of looking that is looking at the problem, and there is a way of looking that is looking at the person. You looked at the person. She held his gaze. I had not been looked at in a long time. It was frightening, and then it wasn't. He thought he understood. He had been, in his own way, looked at in return. Thoroughly, honestly, all the way in. That was the thing about being truly seen. He had come to understand. It went both ways. You could not see someone clearly without being changed by what you saw without showing, in the act of looking, something real about yourself. She had seen him. He had not been afraid. Some things, once they find their shape, stay that way. The stone walls of the house, the roots of the garden. The particular way a wound, properly tended, becomes just a scar, not a wound anymore, not something to hide, but part of the map of a person's life, there in the skin, readable to anyone who knows how to look. She had taught him how to look. He had given her somewhere worth staying. That was enough. That was, it turned out, everything.